administration. The spoils system and rotation in office. First of all, they wanted office for themselves regardless of their fitness. They therefore extended the system of rewarding party workers with government positions, a system early established in several states, notably New York and Pennsylvania. Closely connected with it was the practice of fixing short-term officers and making frequent changes in personnel. Quote, "long continuance in office," explained a champion of this ideal in Pennsylvania in 1837, "unfits a man for the discharge of its duties by rendering him arbitrary and aristocratic, and tends to beget first life office and then hereditary office, which leads to the destruction of free government." End quote. The solution offered was the historic doctrine of, quote, "rotation in office." At the same time, the principle of popular election was extended to an increasing number of officials who had once been appointed either by the governor or the legislature. Even geologists, veterinarians, surveyors, and other technical officers were declared elective on the theory that their appointment, quote, "smacked of monarchy." End quote. Popular election of presidential electors. In a short time, the spirit of democracy, while playing havoc with the old order in state government, made its way upward into the federal system. The framers of the Constitution, bewildered by many proposals and unable to agree on any single plan, had committed the choice of presidential electors to the discretion of the state legislatures. The legislatures, in turn, greedy of power, early adopted the practice of choosing the electors themselves. But they did not enjoy it long undisturbed. Democracy, thundering at their doors, demanded that they surrender the privilege to the people. Reluctantly they yielded, sometimes granting popular election and then withdrawing it. The drift was inevitable, and the climax came with the advent of Jacksonian democracy. In 1824, Vermont, New York, Delaware, South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana, though some had experimented with popular election, still left the choice of electors with the legislature. 8 years later, South Carolina alone held to the old practice. Popular election had become the final word. The fanciful idea of an electoral college of, quote, "good and wise men," end quote, selected without passion or partnership by state legislatures acting as deliberative bodies, was exploded for all time. The election of the nation's chief magistrate was committed to the tempestuous methods of democracy. The nominating convention. As the suffrage was widened and the popular choice of presidential electors extended, there arose a violent protest against the methods used by the political parties in nominating candidates. After the retirement of Washington, both the Republican and the Federalists found it necessary to agree upon their favorites before the election, and they adopted a colonial device, the pre-election caucus. The Federalist members of Congress held a conference and selected their candidate, and the Republicans followed the example. In a short time, the practice of nominating by a congressional caucus became a recognized institution. The election still remained with the people, but the power of picking candidates for their approval passed into the hands of a small body of senators and representatives. A reaction against this was unavoidable. To friends of, quote, the plain people, like Andrew Jackson, it was intolerable, all the more so because the caucus never favored him with the nomination. More conservative men also found grave objections to it. They pointed out that whereas the Constitution intended the president to be an independent officer, he had now fallen under the control of a caucus of congressmen. The supremacy of the legislative branch had been obtained by an extra-legal political device. To such objections were added practical considerations. In 1824, when personal rivalry had taken the place of party conflicts, the Congressional caucus selected as candidate William H. Crawford of Georgia, a man of distinction but no great popularity, passing by such an obvious hero as General Jackson. The followers of the general were enraged and demanded nothing short of the death of, quote, King Caucus. Their clamor was effective. Under their attacks, the caucus came to an ignominious end. In place of it, there arose in 1831 a new device, the National Nominating Convention, composed of delegates elected by party voters for the sole purpose of nominating candidates. Senators and representatives were still prominent in the party councils, but they were swamped by hundreds of delegates, quote, fresh from the people, as Jackson was wont to say. In fact, each convention was made up mainly of office holders and office seekers, and the new institution was soon denounced as vigorously as King Caucus had been, particularly by statesmen who failed to obtain a nomination. Still, it grew in strength and by 1840 was firmly established. The end of the old generation. In the election of 1824, the representatives of the, quote, aristocracy made their last successful stand. Until then, the leadership by men of, quote, wealth and talents had been undisputed. There had been 5 presidents: Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, all Eastern men brought up in prosperous families with the advantages of culture which come from leisure and the possession of life's refinements. None of them had ever been compelled to work with his hands for a livelihood. 4 of them had been slaveholders. Jefferson was a philosopher, learned in natural science, a master of foreign languages, a gentleman of dignity and grace of manner, notwithstanding his studied simplicity. Madison, it was said, was armed, quote, with all the culture of his century. Monroe was a graduate of William and Mary, a gentleman of the old school. Jefferson and his 3 successors called themselves Republicans and professed a genuine faith in the people, but they were not, quote, of the people themselves. They were not sons of the soil or the workshop. They were all men of, quote, the grand old order of society, who gave finish and style even to popular government. Monroe was the last of the presidents belonging to the heroic epoch of the Revolution. He had served in the War for Independence, in the Congress